welcome to Love Like This. My name's Maddie and I'm going to be hosting you tonight. Love Like This, as I'm sure you're aware, is a week of talks about Jesus put on by the Christian Union. So we're going to be here every lunchtime and every evening this week. Our evening speaker for the week is Andy Croft, who currently is working for a large church in Watford. He's secretly confessed to us that he would love a career in modelling, but he's just biding his time, awaiting his moment for now. Through the evenings this week, Andy will be walking us through the Gospel of Mark, one of the historical accounts of Jesus' life. And we'll be looking together at how Jesus engaged with and loved those around him. This evening, the title is Love Like This, Calm the Storm, from Mark 4, 35 to 41. After Andy's spoken, we're going to hear a bit from Abby, who's a student here in Oxford. She's going to tell us a bit about how she came to know Jesus and what difference it's made in her life. Following that, we'll have a time for question and answer, so do be keeping a log of any questions you might have throughout this evening that you can ask later on. We'll aim to finish by about 9:15, but for now I'll pass over to Andy.
Thank you, Maddie, for making that up about me. Yeah, just to say good evening and hello, my name is Andy, and as Maddie says, I work for a church in Watford, so it's very nice to come and visit Oxford, which is much more pleasant than Watford. And the purpose of this evening, there's a guy from Watford here, sorry. I'm from Watford too. The purpose of these evening talks is, I just want to share some thoughts from the Bible. We're going to be looking at you'll have a copy of what's called Mark's Gospel on your chair that we're going to be referring to in a minute. Some of you are probably sitting on it. But the purpose of the evening talks is not so much for me to give a philosophical defense of Christianity. It's much more, as I described it at the lunchtime talk, a little bit like if you want to buy a house, what do? One thing you do is you go and you look at it from the outside and you analyse its structures and you see whether it looks structurally sound, and you peer through the window maybe and you see if it looks nice inside. And you might talk to a few people about whether or not it's nice inside. But really, if you want to buy a house, what you do is you go into it and you wander around it, don't you? You try and get a feel for what it might be like, you try and pick up the vibes, you try and go through the different rooms. And the purpose of the evening talks is just that. I want, if you will, just for a few minutes this evening, come home with me. Come into Christianity. Come and just get the vibe. See what it feels like from the inside. And wander around, put your feet up on the couch, have a beer, soak it up. See if, while you're here, what's being said makes rational sense. See if it makes emotional sense. See if it makes empirical sense, see if it makes spiritual sense, see if it smells authentic, see if it seems real. Come home with me for a while. Wander around. And for the next few evenings, I'm going to be going through the different rooms and we're going to be talking mainly about the person of Jesus. Christianity lives and falls by the person of Jesus Christ. Before it's a religion that we sign up to, a set of beliefs that we tick a box next to, a philosophy that we agree with, it's about a person, Jesus. He's at the centre of it. It's about having a relationship with him and coming to know him. And the title for this evening's talk is Love Like This Calms the Storm. It's talking about the love of God and what it can do for us in our lives. And I'm going to be basing what I'm saying about Jesus from that book that you have in your hand, Mark. Most people date it to 65 AD. So it's one of the 4 accounts of Jesus' life that we have in the New Testament. And I'm going to be picking out stories from it as we go and building something of a picture about who Jesus is and what he means for us and whether or not it's worth getting to know him anymore. So the story that I want to talk about tonight is going to be on page 10. If you have your little book, why don't you grab it and turn with me to page 10. And just hold your finger in the passage there, because I'm going to read it in a minute. But before I do that, I want to say really why I think that this story matters. And the reason that I think it matters is because in the West, we have more stuff than we have ever had before. And even though we had the economic crisis a couple of years ago, we're still more prosperous than we've ever been, and we have basically products for everything. So we have products to speed life up, and we can have caffeine. I'm sure there's some good coffee bars here in Oxford. We've got Red Bull that gives our essays wings, and we have those monster pints of energy drink that we get in the exam term when it's all going wrong. And as well as having all of these things that speed life up, we also have other products that help us slow life down. So you can get some Redox bubble bath, or some aromatherapy candles, or some marijuana if you live in America now. And you can do these things just to help slow life down. We also have, we can do more things than we've ever done before. So in the last little while, we have landed people on the moon, and we have done open heart surgery, and we have invented the iPhone. And yeah, I want to suggest that one of the things that we're still lacking in the West, in the UK, in Oxford, here, is peace. I think we're still missing it. For all that we've found, don't you? I think we're still missing it. And one of the reasons I think we're missing it is because you see all these symptoms everywhere in society, you see it all around us. And I was reading this article a couple of years ago, some of it's stupid stuff, so I was reading this article about an ITV1 documentary that was coming out, and the new principle for documentaries these days seem to be find odd people and then just film them being themselves. And there was this article that was about this documentary that came out. It was about phobias and things people are afraid of, and it says, while spiders and heights are common sources of anxiety, many people's lives are blighted by phobias of seemingly innocuous objects. David Allison, a therapist based at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, was filmed treating some of the worst sufferers in an ITV1 documentary to be shown next week. They include Sue Williams, 37, from Dudley in the West Midlands, who is so terrified of knees that she has not touched her own for 16 years and cannot say kneecap without bursting into tears. I don't like my own. I can't touch them, as a Sue, which probably doesn't sound like this. I don't like my own. I can't touch them. I certainly can't touch anyone else's, she says. I know it's strange. People tease me about it, and they have got every right to. But I think I'm the normal one, and everyone else is weird. Sure, Sue. Until her therapy sessions, Mrs. Williams was unable to wash her knees in the bath and could not look at her husband's knees. Mr. Allison's treatment involved showing her photographs of knees, which reduced her to sobs. In the final session, he wore a pair of shorts and encouraged her to look at his kneecaps until the feelings of terror subsided. True story. There are other people in here. Louise Arnold from Gloucester has a pea phobia, which means she cannot walk down the frozen food aisle of the supermarket. Explaining her dislike of peas, she said, "They tend to just look at me, ganging up on me. All the hairs on the back of my neck go up. I have to know where they are in the supermarket before I go in. It's just controlling my life now." Other sufferers in the program include Kim Crosby from Cambridge, who is terrified of barns. She says, "It's very hampering in the summertime because I would like to drive around with the roof of my car down, but then there is nothing to protect me." So, anyway, there are other people in the program. There's one woman who sprints from the entrance to her house to her car because she thinks someone's going to be hiding in her garden, and other things like that. And what we find is there are people who are afraid of all sorts of the strangest things, but also there are other, perhaps more serious things that we see cripple us and that affect us as people and as human beings. And it's not hard to find statistics that support this. Things that are going on in the UK, things that often sometimes are left under the surface. So here's a few, and there's statistics, but try to understand, try to see them as people. Self-harm statistics in the UK show that we have one of the highest rates of self-harm in Europe, at 400 people per 100,000 in the population. 1 in 12 children and young people deliberately self-harm. According to a 2013 survey by the Office of National Statistics, nearly 1/5 of adults in the UK suffers from depression. The World Health Organization says it's 15% of the population in developed countries have depression. Depression affects 1 in 5 elderly people living at home, 2 in 5 living in a care home. Nearly 80,000 children and young people suffer from severe depression. Over 8,000 children under the age of 10 have severe depression. Suicide is the most common cause of death in men under the age of 35. Last year, over 5,500 people in the UK committed suicide. In 2007-2008, 420,000 individuals in Britain believed they experienced work-related stress at a level that was making them ill. An estimated 1 in 100 women between the ages of 15 and 30 has anorexia. There's about 1 million people in the UK have been diagnosed with an eating disorder. Some of them are children as young as 7, being treated for anorexia. And it's more than a list of statistics, it's people, it's what's going on. And one of the other things that's going on, I would suggest, is that there's a loneliness in our culture. And there are more of us on this tiny little island than there have ever been, living closer together than we've ever lived, and yet we're further apart. Mother Teresa's the one that talked about poverty as the great disease of the Western world. And although there's good stuff going on, and you see all good things everywhere, you see dignity and compassion, and people who've got guts, and people who are going for it, at the same time there are people who are killing themselves and abusing themselves and injecting themselves. And there's a lack of peace in our culture. We've found all these things, but we haven't found that. And it may be that you're here, and I understand if you are, and you're feeling like, oh, hang on a second, I actually feel fine. You know, fair enough, there are people who have that, but I actually feel okay. But the peace that I'm talking about in Christianity, the peace that comes from knowing Jesus, is a different kind of peace. It's not simply contentment, it's not simply a lack of stress. And one of the things I like to do when I need to think is I like to go somewhere quiet. Unfortunately, I live in Watford, and so there's not many places I can go, but there is one field that I can go to where I can only just hear the A41. It's beautiful. And then a little while ago, I remember I went to the Grand Canyon with a friend of mine, and we were standing at the top of the Grand Canyon, taking it all in, and then we walked down inside the canyon. And he wasn't very fit, and I was quite competitive, so I left him behind. And carried on going down. And anyway, I carried on going down. As I was going down, I was listening to some music on my iPod headphones, just kind of enjoying being there. And I got right down to the bottom, and it was this burning blue sky up above, and these, the red walls of the canyon everywhere, desert at the bottom. When I was at the bottom, I pressed pause on my iPod. And when I pressed pause, I heard the heavy weight of silence is a very different thing from quiet. Up until that point, I thought I knew what quiet was, and then I felt something very different. What I'm suggesting is that in coming to know God, in coming to know peace, it's not simply an absence of strife and an absence of stress. It's the presence of something called shalom, wholeness, and it's a really different thing. And I've found in my own experience, maybe you can relate, I think I've got it all together. And my life is like a glass full of water. And so long as no one knocks me, I can just about keep it all in the glass. But then something happens and it all spills up. And so, because we're searching for peace, this story matters. So, why don't we read from verse 35 of chapter 4, which is just at the top of page 10. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, that's Jesus, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." And I was driving just 2 weeks ago. We've had all this crazy weather recently, haven't we? I was driving 2 weeks ago and I found myself driving through a storm. I was actually on my way to Cambridge, Blue His. And I was driving there, and as I was driving there, suddenly this storm came in, and it was just me in the car, and it was like mental. There was these purple, dark clouds everywhere, the rain was coming down, I was trying to keep the car on the road, I slowed down on the motorway to go 50 miles an hour, and there was these flashes of lightning and thunder that happened, and it felt like it was happening just above me, to the point where I was literally in the car by myself going, "Whoa!" out loud, as I was driving along. And a tree had fallen on the motorway and all these cars and stuff. It was crazy. I was there in a car on a motorway, nice and warm and dry. Flashback to Galilee, Lake Galilee, where these guys are, 2,000 years ago. And Galilee is known for having these squalls that they're just sweeping out of nowhere. And they're in a boat. They're not in a car, they haven't got aircon, they haven't got music. They're out in a boat on this wild lake, and the rain is lashing down, and the waves, we're told, are pounding the boat, to the point where these guys who are professional fishermen, and therefore experts at knowing what's going on, professional fishermen start to panic. They start to lose their heads. They start to think that they're going to die. And then they look over at Jesus, the hero of the Bible, and there he is, on a cushion, in the back of the boat, fast asleep. And can you imagine if you're in a situation like that, where you are, let's say, driving along a really dangerous mountain pass or something, and suddenly there's an avalanche, and you're trying to keep the car on the road, and you think, oh my word, there's no barrier there, we could well fall off. And how would you feel in that situation? Your eyes would be wide, your palms would be sweaty, the fear would be going, adrenaline would be pumping, and you're trying to stay alive there, and then you glance over at your mate who's just in the back of the car. How would you do it? You'd slap him around the face, wouldn't you? You'd be like, what the heck are you? We're about to die here, and I'm just trying to keep us alive. You know, at least panic. And so the disciples, when they see Jesus like this, of course that's how they react. They turn to him, they wake him up. I don't know why the waves weren't waking him up anyway, but he was obviously very tired. But they woke him up, and they say to the teacher, don't you care if we drown? When we come into the house, when we come into Christianity, we're coming into belief that there's a God. Do you know one of the first questions anyone who comes to believe in God asks? God, don't you care if I drown? Look at this world, Lord. Look at the suffering. Look at the pain. Look at the world that's going on, the stuff that's going on all over the place. Look at the pain in my own life. One of the first questions any sane person asks is, don't you care about me, Lord? Don't you care if I drown, if you are there? Because suddenly these questions about how life seems to be unfair and these things they seem to happen to us, they're not just abstract questions anymore, they're questions that become directed at someone. And when we come to know this someone, our anger and sometimes our frustration and our real questions, they're directed at him. They're all over the Bible, people crying out, where are you, God? Why aren't you here? Don't you care? When we come into the house, we still have questions about stuff. And there's a Christian author called Philip Yancey who's written a lot about this, and he says this in one of his books. Why must I keep circling back to the problem of pain? I sometimes wonder. Then, on a book tour, I meet an older man with a full beard who walks to the microphone with a shuffle and mumbles, God gave me Parkinson's disease. How can I possibly think God listens to what I have to say in prayer? I hear accounts of suicides, birth defects, terminal diseases, and children hit by trucks. A woman confesses praying in a desperation during her 19 years of an abusive marriage. Lord, if someone is killed by a drunk driver, let it be my husband. I meet a woman afflicted with multiple sclerosis, shockingly young, who limps over to tell me she is learning all she can about prayer because the disease is progressing so quickly, soon she will be capable of little else. I speak on the topic of grace, and a woman approached the book table to tell me she needs to work on forgiveness. Don't we all, I say. No, really, I need to, she replies, and proceeds to tell me that her father murdered her husband. First he stole my past by abusing me, now he has stolen my future. Yet she doesn't want her children to grow up hating their grandfather who is serving time in prison. A man behind her waits patiently as we talk, and then tells me of his daughter's rape in the parking garage of Phoenix Airport. She decided to keep the child, a daughter, he says. She names her Grace. Don't you care if we drown? Is a question that we ask all the time. And the answer that God gives, and the answer that this passage in this whole book gives, is yes, I care. And the way that it gives the answer, maybe it's not the way we'd always like it, the way that it gives, the way that he shows he cares, is he comes into the storm. He becomes one of us. That's the heart of what we believe about Jesus Christ, that he is God made man. He becomes one of us. And he walks around, and he goes through suffering, and he goes through pain. And Christianity is a religion that the symbol of it, the heart of it, is a cross. Have you ever thought about how mad that is? A torture symbol at the heart of a religion. We may as well have like a gas chamber or an electric chair. That's what it is. What sort of religion puts a cross at the heart of it itself? A religion that takes suffering and fear and pain very, very seriously. He comes himself. But at that point in the boat, on the storm, Jesus doesn't say that. He asks them a question of his own. And that's what we can expect of God. If God is real, surely when we come to him with our challenges and our questions, surely we would expect him to confront us in some way and to bring questions of his own, wouldn't we? And the question that Jesus says to them, first of all, he turns to the wind and the waves, And he says, quiet, be still. And you can imagine again the sea. Suddenly these waves that have been pounding and smashing and bashing this boat around, suddenly they're just still as a mill pond. And the wind that's been howling around drops. And in the stillness and the quiet, he turns to them and he says this: why are you afraid? Ever wondered about that question? I'm afraid, Lord, because I need to keep my life in control. And I'm scared that one day it'll spin out and I won't be able to do anything about it. I'm afraid, Lord, because I'm desperately lonely and I've never told anyone, and I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this front up. I'm afraid, Lord, because I'm living my life based in a particular way, but it doesn't seem to be working out for me. I'm afraid, Lord, because I've just been dumped, and I don't know if I'm going to get another boyfriend or another girlfriend. I'm afraid, Lord, because my parents never seem to really care about what I'm doing if I don't hit their standard. I'm afraid, Lord, because at some stage I'm going to leave this place and I'm going to go out and find a job and find a meaning and try and find a purpose. I'm afraid, Lord, because I still don't know who I am, even though I've achieved everything I've ever tried to up until this point. I'm afraid, Lord, because it's just too hard and I'm not sure I'll make it and I don't think I can do it. I'm afraid because the waves are too big and the wind is too strong and my boat is too small. I'm afraid that I'll drown. And his next question: why don't you trust me? Now my response to that will be, well, how can I trust you if I don't know who you are? How can I trust you? And this is the crucial thing, it's this thing of who he is. Who is he? And to quote one writer, David Watson, he says, I am far within the mark when I say that all the armies that have ever marched, and all the nations that have ever, all the navies that have ever sailed, and all the parliaments that have ever sat, and all the kings that have ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of humanity on earth as much as this one single, solitary life. And we look at the life of Jesus with this question of who he is. And one of the things that we see is this sort of this paradox of the fact that he's born with the stigma of illegitimacy at a time when in that culture that was a huge deal. And he spent the first 2 years of his life as a refugee in Egypt, that he was born in Bethlehem, which is the wrong side of the tracks, and he grew up in Nazareth, which is the back end of nowhere. And that all he ever did is gather a small bunch of followers that eventually really didn't do a very good job. One of them betrayed him, one of them denied ever knowing him, the others abandoned him when it got tough. And then he died a humiliating death, as we've talked about, on the cross. And yet, he's sleeping in a storm. He didn't have all the things that we look to when we look for security, when we look for peace, the DVD box set to hide yourself in. He didn't have any of that. And yet he slept in storms. And what the Bible calls him is this phrase, the Prince of Peace. And peace isn't something that drops out of heaven like a gift parcel from John Lewis arrives at your door. That's not what it is. Peace is to know this person who is peace. And for a while there, I thought that to come to know, when Christians talk about, come and know Jesus and you find peace, I misunderstood that. And what I thought it meant was that Jesus was like a stress ball. Or like, some of that soothing music that you can buy in National Trust gift shops, like the sound of birds or something that you can play when you're falling asleep. And it's like, Jesus is just going to kind of soothe my life away. That's not how it is. What we see is when he calms the storm, the disciples, they become more afraid. Did you see that? When they were afraid of the storm, they become more afraid of Jesus. Because at that moment they thought, hang on a second, we've just been thinking you're the son of a carpenter and a good moral teacher, and suddenly we see you have this authority to calm wind and stop waves. And they start asking themselves the question, who the heck is this guy? They grow more afraid of him. And the reason they're afraid of Jesus and the reason he is a calm in a storm is because he's stronger than the storm. That's why we trust him. And when we come to know him, it's not that he slots into our lives. That's not how it works in the home. When we come to know him, we become part of his life. And he is uncontrollable. He is completely unmanageable. I've tried it. He just won't listen to me. He's unpredictable. But he's never unfaithful. And C.S. Lewis captures this in his picture of Aslan in the Narnia books. And there's this one particular scene that comes in the silver chair. And Jill has just arrived in Narnia for the first time. And she's wandering around and she's a bit afraid and she's very, very thirsty. And eventually she sees this lion sort of everywhere. The lion's representing Jesus in the book. And she sees this stream. She comes across this stream, and on this side of the stream is a lion. The lion lying there. And the lion says to her, "If you're thirsty, you may drink." But Jill is afraid. "Will you promise not to do anything to me if I come?" she asks. The lion replies, "I make no promises." Jill was so thirsty now that without noticing it, she had come a step nearer. "Do you eat girls?" she said. "I have swallowed up girls and boys, women and men, kings and emperors, cities and realms," said the lion. It didn't say this as if it were boasting, nor as if it was sorry, nor as if it were angry. It just said it. "I daren't come and drink," said Jill. "Then you will die of thirst," said the lion. "Oh dear," said Jill. Not a good thing in army either. "Oh dear," said Jill, coming a step nearer. "I suppose I must go and look for another stream then." "There is no other stream," said the lion. He's uncontrollable, and he's unmanageable, and he's unpredictable. But when we approach him, he invites us to drink. And there is no other stream, no other place, nowhere else we can go where we will find wholeness and peace. And I'm going to talk more about what it means as we go on. It's got a whole lot to do with our own selfishness and the brokenness and the selfishness of the world. But what I will say tonight is Jesus says these words. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and you will find rest for your souls." Elsewhere, one of my favourite verses in the whole Bible is, "In peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety." And the peace that I find, the peace that we find when we come to know God, is not that all of the storms suddenly disappear, they don't. But it's a little bit like there was a painting competition in World War II, and there were these two paintings that got to the kind of the top two. And the competition was, because it was the middle of the World War, was to paint a peaceful scene. And the painting that came second was this painting of a beautiful kind of classic English landscape like the Lake District, lots of little sheep everywhere, very calm, very nice. The painting that won was, initially you looked at it and you had to look twice, because it was like painting a peaceful scene, because the scene was this waterfall that was just going mental. All the waters had just melted, and it was going absolutely crazy from the waters that melted over the winter. And then you looked at it for a moment, it looked completely chaotic, and then what you could see is you could make out, just in the corner of the painting, sheltered by an outcrop, was this little nest of birds hiding there, protected in the middle of the craziness. What he does is he comes into the storm. And I don't understand it. The Bible calls it peace that transcends understanding, but it enters our hearts and it enters our lives. I just want to finish by reading one story. It's in a book that a guy called John Ortberg has written about an encounter he had with a lady that he met in a hospital. And he says this: "The state-run hospital is not a pleasant place. It is large, understaffed, and overfilled with senile and helpless and lonely people who are waiting to die. On the brightest of days, it seems dark inside, and it smells of sickness and stale urine. I went there once or twice a week for 4 years, but I never wanted to go there, and I always left with a sense of relief. It is not the kind of place that one gets used to. On this particular day, I was walking in a hallway I had not visited before, looking in vain for a few who were alive enough to receive a flower and a few words of encouragement. This hallway seemed to contain some of the worst cases, strapped onto carts or into wheelchairs and looking completely helpless. As I neared the end of this hallway, I saw an old woman strapped up in a wheelchair. Her face was an absolute horror. The empty stare and white pupils of her eyes told me that she was blind. The large hearing aid over one ear told me that she was almost deaf. One side of her face was being eaten by cancer. There was a discoloured and running sore covering part of one cheek, and it had pushed her nose to one side, dropped one eye, and distorted her jaw, so that what should have been the corner of her mouth was the bottom of her mouth. As a consequence, she drooled constantly. I was told later that when new nurses arrived, the supervisors would send them to feed this woman, thinking that if they could stand this sight, they could stand anything in the building. I also learned that this woman was 89 years old, and that she had been here, bedridden, blind, nearly deaf, and alone, 25 years. This was Mabel. I don't know why I spoke to her. She looked less likely to respond than most of the people I saw in that hallway. But I put a flower in her hand and said, "Here is a flower for you. Happy Mother's Day." Mabel and I became friends over the next few weeks, and I went to see her once or twice a week for the next 3 years. I never heard her speak of loneliness or pain, except in the stress that she placed on certain lines and certain hymns. During one hectic week of final exams, I was frustrated because my mind seemed to be pulled in 10 directions at once with all the things that I had to think about. And the question occurred to me, what does Mabel have to think about, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, not even able to know if it's day or night? So I went to her and asked, "Mabel, what do you think about while you lie here?" And she said, "I think about my Jesus." And then Mabel began to sing an old hymn. "Jesus is all the world to me, my life, my joy, my all. He is my strength from day to day. Without him, I would fall. When I am sad, to him I go. No other one can cheer me so. When I am sad, he makes me glad. He's my friend." Seconds ticked, and minutes crawled. And so did days and weeks and months and years of pain, without human company and without an explanation as to why it was all happening. And she lay there and sang hymns. How could she do it? The message of Christianity is that she could do it because she came to know someone who was a deeper peace. We call him the Prince of Peace. And because he was in the boat of her life, even though all that crap was going on, she could still know something here. It may be this doesn't make any sense to you. I respect that. Maybe you haven't spent an evening in the home and you think, "I don't know, we're going to get out of this madhouse." Maybe you want to come back tomorrow night, come and visit again and see what you think. Maybe you never want to go, in which case you're very welcome to stay. Although I think they shut this place. It's a metaphor. But I just want to finish really with these questions that Jesus asks the disciples there in the boat. Why are you afraid? What's stopping you from trusting me? Over the next few days, Pete will be doing some talks at lunchtime. I'll be doing some more evening ones. I'm going to try and find answers today. I want to say from the bottom of my heart, there is a peace that passes understanding. And when we come to know Jesus, we find that. Maddie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andy. And I'm sure that those of you have questions following that talk. There's a number up on the screen there that you can text your questions into, and we'll get onto that a little bit later. While you're doing that, I'm going to ask Abby up to come and tell us something of how she came to know Jesus and the difference that his love has made in her life. Abby is a fresher at Balliol studying law, and I'll hand over to her now. Thank you.
Okay, so trying to work out what I wanted to say tonight, I found really difficult, I think for two reasons. The first is, my journey to getting to know Christ has been a very long, very difficult journey, and still is that way. In order to explain my testimony properly, I'm going to have to talk about some quite personal things to a room full of people, which seems quite daunting. But I guess the second reason is that I'm going to be talking about what is the most important thing in my life, and really the reason I'm still alive today. Yet, if you'd asked me a couple of years ago whether I'd be standing on a stage talking about Jesus, I probably would have laughed in your face and walked off in the other direction as quickly as I could. So yeah, I've been sort of thinking to myself, how on earth do I do this justice and speak to all these people? But as a friend of mine reminded me a few weeks ago, I may be a law student, but I'm not a lawyer here tonight, and I'm just a witness, and I just really pray that I can just be as honest as I can and be a witness to God's work. So I was born into a really, really wonderful family, completely lovely and completely atheist. For me as a child, Jesus and God, it was just like a fairy tale really. I wanted to believe it. It was quite nice, but I didn't believe it at all. I had this real fear of death when I was younger, so the idea was very attractive, but I was told that it would be a stupid thing to believe, that it wasn't true, so I just put the idea to the back of my mind. So I'm going to skip forward. You don't have to hear the ins and outs of my childhood. So we'll pick up again when I started secondary school, and believe it or not, from me standing up here today, I was very, very shy when I was younger, and as such, it was really difficult to make friends. And the structure of my family as well meant that I became very independent when I was young. My older sister is quite severely deaf, and she suffers from very bad anxiety. So my parents seemed to need her a lot more than I did. And being very young and having very low confidence, I sort of took this lack of attention and the fact that I couldn't make friends to mean that I was a bad person, that I was second best to my parents. And I sort of subconsciously set about to change that. I put myself under a huge amount of pressure to be just good at everything I did, and to the outside world it sort of seemed like, yeah, she's doing great, but actually I was really very unhappy. I was very lonely, and I developed a real sense of inadequacy when I was very young. I would distract myself for long periods of time with whatever made me happy for a while, sport, music, anything, but nothing lasted, and the inadequacy that I felt always returned. I really, really hated myself, and it manifested in hating the way that I looked, and I convinced myself that I was fat, that I was ugly, and just became so much more unhappy just all the time. I just blamed myself for everything that went on around me, and especially with my family. My parents started having problems, and I was completely convinced that it was my own fault. So when I was about 16, I developed a voice in my head that told me that I was completely worthless, but if I stopped eating, I could do something about that, and that I would be happy, and I believed that voice. I became extremely underweight, but the voice still told me that I didn't deserve to eat. It was a really, really difficult time for my family, as they tried to deal with the fact that I was just distracting myself in front of them, and my parents' relationship completely broke down. I was in this real cycle of guilt that I couldn't eat because I was a bad person, but the fact that I was a bad person was just eating away at me, really, and it was a really, really difficult time. As I became more and more ill, I seemed to become even worse a person. I became cruel, I became deceitful, I became manipulative, and I would just do anything not to eat. One afternoon I had a huge argument with my mum. I spent about 3 hours sitting at the dinner table, refusing to eat anything, looking her in the eye, refusing to eat no matter what she said or did. But at this point I was just unable to fight the voices that I was having in my head anymore. And I decided a few weeks before this that I wanted to die, and I walked out of the house after that argument and decided that that was going to be the day. So I walked out of the village where I lived in the country, and I walked up this muddy path. I was quite weak at this point, and after about a mile I fell down to my knees, and out of absolutely nowhere, after barely thinking of faith for years, I cried out for God, and I shouted that if he existed, then I needed him right then. And this God that I tried to forget about, that I turned my back on and said was stupid, he didn't turn away from me. And kneeling on that path, weaker than I had ever been before in my life, I felt a sense for the first time in such a long time that I wasn't on my own. I didn't see anything, I didn't feel anything, but I got the surest sense in my heart that the Lord was with me and I didn't have to face this on my own. My mum found me a while later, and I was still kneeling there on the path, and she took me home. And I sat down and ate a bowl of custard, which seems like the littlest thing in the world now, but it was a step on my journey to recovery. And I was assessed a few days later, and I started treatment for anorexia and the other issues that I've been suffering with. You would think that after God brought me back from the edge like that, I would have become a Christian and devoted myself to him straight away, but I didn't. Recovering from anorexia was the scariest and hardest thing that I've ever had to do, and although I wanted to get better, the idea of putting on weight just seemed like the worst thing in the world. I knew that God existed, but I wasn't ready to trust him, and at times I cursed him for the fact that he had brought me back because it was so hard. But he stayed with me, and he kept giving me opportunities to turn to him again. Physically I got better, and mentally things were improving, but I was quite unhappy still. My parents had separated, and the struggle of my illness had completely broken down my relationship with my dad. But I had a friend who was a Christian who invited me down to her church youth group, and I was really intrigued because she said to me that knowing Christ gave her joy that she had never felt before, and I felt like I hadn't felt joy in such a long time. So I went along with her, quite sceptically, but I really loved it, and I started to learn more about God and be able to ask questions that I had, and I started to feel happier about myself. Outside of the church, I started to explore my faith a little bit more, and tentatively I would pray and read the Bible, but it all felt a little bit strange to me. Throughout this time, I was lying to my family about where I was, because I didn't think they'd be happy about it. And I was quite worried about that, and I was right to be worried, because when my dad found out, he was really rather angry. He was very hurt that in the midst of our own relationship breaking down, that I would rather spend time with my imaginary friend, as he called it, than spend time with him and try and repair our relationship. And I stopped going to church and tried to turn away from God again. But I got another opportunity last summer, and I applied to work in an American summer camp and got asked to work on one that happened to be a Christian camp, and it was just the most incredible experience. For the first time, I felt safe to really be open about the fact that I believed in God, and my co-counsellors there were just amazing at helping me explore my belief. I felt freer than I had in such a long time, and it was just incredible. But even then, praying just felt strange to me, because asking anyone for help, let alone asking God for help, felt the strangest thing. I felt selfish. I didn't feel worthy, and even then, I still wasn't quite ready to trust. So the summer ended and I came home, but I wasn't willing to forget about what I'd learned quite so quickly. And I wasn't willing to forget that joy that I had felt in those small amounts of time that I had been willing to trust in God. I was a bit more open with my family, which was hard, but I really wasn't willing to give up. I arrived in Oxford last term, very nervous, and really at a crossroads in my life, I think, because unlike at home or at camp, no one here was going to tell me that I had to eat, and no one was going to notice if I didn't. And I started letting sort of old thoughts creep back into my head, but this time I wasn't alone, and I had God to help me, and I knew that I had to let him help me. I started going to St. Aldgate's Church, and it just felt like home to me. The sermons really fitted in with the way I was feeling, and it felt like God was speaking right at me. I realised that I had a choice as to whether I was going to get ill again, and it was an incredible choice. And like I said, at a crossroads, God started to guide me down the right path. I started an alpha group. I started going to an alpha group, and after a few weeks, shared my story with the group, who just became the most incredible support. As the course progressed, I felt more and more inclined to pray, to read the Bible, until I realised one day that I wasn't doing it because I felt I should. I was doing it because I really wanted to. And I learned so much about God here in my first time at Oxford, and I'm just so lucky and so grateful that he was there for me and did guide me down that path. So over the last few months, having God in my life has given me a new perspective, and it's given me a purpose that I've never experienced from anything else. The freedom that I've got from constantly looking for the approval of others and comparing myself has just completely changed who I am. I'd be lying if I said that I found life easy now. And every day I have to remind myself not to let the voices back into my head. And it's hard, but I'm not doing it in my own strength anymore. Every day God gives me greater understanding, greater freedom, and greater assurance that I'm where He wants me to be. I have a lot of stumbles and a lot of struggles, but I'm constantly reminded that I'm not alone, I'm not inadequate, and that God created me this way for a reason. The Lord is my strength now, and He gives me a hope and greater freedom than I've ever experienced, and I wouldn't be alive today without Him. Knowing the joy that God gives is the most liberating and wonderful feeling, and it's the only thing that can give true satisfaction, and the one thing that can heal the brokenness of our world and the brokenness within each of us. For me, love like this is freedom, it's hope, it's understanding, and most of all, it is peace. Peace of mind, peace of heart, and peace in knowing that I'm never, ever going to be alone. Thank you.
Text in some of your questions, sorry. So I'm going to invite James and MJ and Andy to come back on the stage, and we'll answer some of those. So we've already met Andy, obviously, but if James and MJ, you could just introduce yourselves briefly, that would be fantastic.
I'm James, and I'm married to Caroline, who isn't here tonight because she's stuck on a train somewhere between London and here because of the flooding. And modelling was never an option for me as it was for her. And so I work at St Eb's Church.
That's where all aspiring models go. I'm MJ, and Andy and I are mates actually from uni times. And I'm married to Guy. And got a little baby, Charlie, who's 5 months old. I can't believe it. So I've left him at home, and hopefully he's still listening. It's lovely to be with you all.
So the questions are going to come up on this board here. I'll read them out and then just go for it if you want to answer it. Cool. If we can have the first question, that would be great. So why is peace only found in Jesus? Why can I not find peace in my own way?
You stumped us. That's a really good question. I think there's a number of things, but the main thing is to do with the claims that Jesus makes about himself. So again, because it's only the first night, there's only so much you can fit into half an hour. But what we're going to be saying over the next few days is Jesus makes some pretty radical claims about himself. One of the things that I find fascinating about him is that he is simultaneously incredibly on one level, self-centered in his teaching. So if you look at Jesus' teaching, it's all pointing to himself. So he says, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, and other things like that. And then in his actions, he's incredibly self-effacing. So he's always serving, he's always looking to others, he's always preferring others, he's always humbling himself before others. So you have this paradox of someone who makes massive claims about themselves and yet walks around with incredible humility. And it's this challenge that he brings. The uniqueness of Jesus is a question that is always about coming back to that. So for me, what I found is when I met him, I discovered a peace that I've never found anywhere else. It may be that you find a measure of peace elsewhere, and I think that's entirely valid. I think, of course, you can find a measure of peace elsewhere, but ultimately, it's this thing to do with, and again, we haven't gone into it, but our own brokenness and our own selfishness, and the Bible uses the word sin for that. And the way in which Jesus brings us peace is not simply, as I was trying to say, he's a stress ball, but he comes to be Lord. And the cross is this thing that in many ways sets us free from burdens, and there's no other religion that talks about that. There's no other religion that talks about Jesus in the way in which Christianity does. I don't know if you want to add anything. Either that or try Radox.
Christians often seem to have less restful lives. Is peace found in Jesus fully in this life? And how does heaven fit in?
That's a very good question. I think it's true. I think the premise of the question is true, that Christians do often seem to have less restful lives. And I do think it's interesting in the event that Mark was describing that we were looking at today, that Jesus does lead them into a storm. He leads them out of the storm, but that part of what it meant for them to follow Jesus at that moment was the reality of the storm around them, from which he went on to save them. And I think there are lots of Christians who will be able to testify to that fact, that becoming a Christian gives a deep sense of joy and peace, and yet brings with it a certain amount of trouble as well. And even in this life, authentic Christians would testify to the fact that it is worth it, that the peace that we experience in this life is so much more wonderful than the sufferings that come our way. But it is true to say that the vast majority, if we can put it like this, the vast majority of the peace and the joy and the blessings in the Christian life are ahead as well. So there's a verse in the Bible that says that our present sufferings are incomparable. They're not worth comparing with the joy that will one day be revealed. So I think it is true to say that Christians often can be difficult to be a Christian. There are blessings that come in this life, which Andy's been talking about, and that's nothing compared to the blessings that will one day come. Do you want to add to that?
I found it really helpful, the image that Andy described of that little bird's nest under the waterfall. And I think that is a beautiful picture of how the Bible describes what ultimate peace is like. Knowing peace with God is ultimately a relational thing. It's about knowing Him, the one who is peace, the one who brought order out of chaos, the one who brings peace in a storm. And so Andy talked about this sense of wholeness, which is a really rich word in that, I'm not a Hebrew linguist at all, but in the Hebrew it talks about shalom. And it's this idea that you can actually, in knowing God, you can have peace with Him, and that's ultimate peace. And that even in the midst of storms, you can know Him and you can know real peace. And that often is a feeling. It's not always, but it often is. But it's ultimately a relational thing. That means when you know Him, you're ultimately secure, you're ultimately significant because you're found in God, you belong to Him. It's not Jesus, as Andy was saying, is stressful, but His life becomes your life, and your life's bound up in Him because you know Him and you're united with Him, like those little birds in the nest.
Thank you. As far as I can tell, my life is going well, and I'm certainly not afraid. So why do I need this magician?
Good question. I think it comes back to what I was saying at the start, which is this idea of two things. One is our lives are like this glass full of water. And what I have found, and maybe you've never been knocked, or maybe you feel like you have and you've come back fighting, but what I've found is that there are times and there are seasons, and it's not most of the time, but every now and then, where people are afraid and life doesn't go well. And it's in those moments, at those times of desperation, that really, I think, this need and this sense of need comes to the surface. And the other thing is, again, it's kind of what I was trying to give different pictures of, but it's this suggestion that maybe there could be something even more than where you're at, and even more than the peace you're experiencing. It's a little bit like if you walk down this road, I noticed earlier, you walk down the road, there's all the noise and all the buses and all of that stuff, and then you see there are those doors that lead into the quads, and you just see this little door and you think, well, man, should I go through there? There's no need to, but okay, I will. And you walk through, and what you find is when you walk through, you're suddenly in this new place of quiet, and there's this new garden that's opened up, even just through pushing the door. What I'm suggesting is that maybe this door is worth a push, and maybe you find more through it. Yeah. So if you guys want to add anything.
It kind of reminds me, there's this guy who came up to Jesus and said something kind of similar. He thought he had his life sorted, and he said to him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Kind of tell me if I'm doing the right thing, because I want to know if I'm sorted, if I'm going to heaven." Slightly different, but kind of similar. He wanted to tick the boxes with Jesus, and Jesus said, "Well, you know the commandments. Tell me them. Have you kept them?" And he lists them off, and he says, I've kept all these things, I've done all these right things, do I need any more? And then Jesus says, there's something that you lack. And this guy was really rich, and Jesus challenges him, he says, sell all your possessions and give it to the poor. And why on earth does he do that to this guy? That wasn't in the Ten Commandments. Jesus looks at his heart, and he sees in his heart there is a selfishness, there's a desire to put himself first before God. He doesn't really want to have God as part of his life, he just wants to tick the boxes and be seen like he's doing the right thing. But Jesus is saying, you are living for something that will never satisfy. You are living for money that ultimately is going to enslave you. It's going to make you captive. And he tells him, you need to sell your possessions and give them to the poor. And this guy goes away sad because he doesn't want to do that. What Jesus diagnoses in this guy's heart is he needs Jesus Christ. He needs God because he puts himself before God, and before God he stands as someone who needs his forgiveness, who says, no, I'm not God of this universe, I need the one who really is. And Jesus puts his finger on the pulse, and sometimes he does that with each of us, and he says, there's something that you need to give up. You need to stand before me and say, actually, I need you, Jesus, because I can't find this peace on my own. I can't find forgiveness on my own. Please come and help me. Please come and forgive me. Please come and heal me. That's why we need him. We might not think we do, but we're all like that rich young guy who come to Jesus and want his approval, but he says, you've got to come to me for it.
I have a couple more questions. Is peace necessary, and doesn't progress come through conflict?
Well, I suppose you don't have to have it if you don't want it. I mean, there's lots of things that come through conflict. Lots of, we get stronger if you go to the gym, you work out, you push yourself, you tear your muscles, obviously you get stronger as a result. And in some senses, what happens is when we go through things in life, and things kind of tear us down a little bit, you can maybe rise like a phoenix from the ashes and become even stronger and go back fighting and, all of that sort of stuff. But there's one person that said most men, he was writing a long time ago, most men leave lives of quiet and at times noisy desperation. And I'm conscious that it can come across, and I hope it hasn't tonight, like I'm saying, all of us here completely and utterly desperate, crying out, we're going to die, we're going to drown. Obviously, many of us don't feel like we are in that place, and that's fine. But what I want to suggest is that there are plenty of people around you who probably are, and they might not always let on, and they might keep a lid on it, but underneath the surface, there's a whole load of brokenness and there's a whole load of mess. And what I have found is everyone seems normal until you get to know them, don't they? And in the same way, everyone seems like they've got it all together until you get to know them. And then you discover that in all of us, there are these things that they do tear us up and they do pull us apart. I don't think anyone's insisting that you have to have peace in your life. Nor does having peace in your life mean you live a boring life where there's no controversy and there's no adversary and there's nothing to take, there's no adventure to take. But it's having this peace in the midst of the turmoil that I'm trying to get at. And I think if you want it, it is available. When you meet it.
Pastor, I'll just add one thing to that. Andy mentioned that one of the titles that the Old Testament gives Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Jesus came, at least in part, to give peace to us. And the way that he did that, as we'll be thinking about, I guess, as the week goes on, is by dying on a cross. And you ask the question, if it was unnecessary for us to have peace, then why on earth would God have come in human form and died in order that it should be possible? In God's thinking, at least, it seemed to be of utmost importance that we should be able to have peace. And I guess primarily that's peace with him, peace in relationship with him. That is something that, naturally speaking, none of us have because of the way we turn our back on him. That is something that God came to offer. So yes, we desperately need it.
I think we've got time for one last question, if there's any more. What does someone have to do to get this peace?
Come to the Prince of Peace. it's an open invitation. He's willing and wants to offer you his peace. And when I came to know Jesus for myself, I was encouraged to actually admit before God that I needed him, that I lacked peace, that without him, I'm like a lost sheep. That's how Jesus describes it. So like a lost sheep, just going astray, no direction, no real sense of who's my shepherd. And Jesus described himself as the great shepherd, the good shepherd who lays his life down for his sheep. And he invites us to come to him. And you can do that. You can even do that tonight. Maybe do it with the person who brought you along. Say, you know, what does it actually look like to come to this shepherd? And this friend of mine taught me how to just pray and come to Jesus and say, yeah, Jesus, I need you. Please forgive me that I have run away like a lost sheep, go my own way. I recognise that you are the great shepherd. Thank you for laying down your life for me, that I could know you and that I could have life. You're the one who gave up your life so I could have life. Thank you for that. And please come and live with me so I'm not alone. I heard Abby's story today about she's not alone. That's a wonderful message. We don't just tick a box and say, I believe in Jesus, that he died, but he actually invites us to give our lives to him and then he comes and lives with us. So why don't you, here's a challenge, why don't you ask the friend who brought you along tonight, hey, what does that actually mean? What does it look like? Would you help me if you're ready for that? You might not be interested at all to get this peace.
Thank you very much. I think that's all we've got time for at the moment, so thank you very much.